So, welcome everyone and good evening. My name is Mila Ferrer. I am the Partnerships and Alliance Manager at the Diabetes Link. We are delighted you join us for this important conversation about preparing for college and understanding the accommodations for students with type 1 diabetes. For those of you who may not know us, the Diabetes Link, next slide, please. It's the only national nonprofit exclusively serving young adults with all types of diabetes, ages 18 to 30. We started in 2010 as the College Diabetes Network and rebranded in 2022 to expand our reach beyond campuses. Annie Tulkin is a friend of the house. She worked with us when we were College Diabetes Network many years ago, and we're so happy to have her again. At the Diabetes Link, we empower young adults to thrive, not just manage care, through support, through online community, campus chapters, and practical tools for real life. Our goal is to make sure that every student feels connected, confident, and equipped as they move to the next chapter. Tonight, we are joined again by Annie Tulkin, founder and CEO of Accessible College. Annie has spent her career helping students with disabilities and health conditions transition successfully to college. If you were on our previous webinar, Annie was part of the speakers alongside with Adrienne. They were talking about what happens when your son goes or your daughter goes to college living with a health condition. It was a great resource, and we have that webinar saved on our resource hub. If you want to go ahead and share it, I'll be sharing the link later on. Annie spent 6 years at Georgetown University's Academic Resource Center supporting undergrad, grad, and medical students, and holds a master's in special education and certificate in health coaching. Annie, thank you so much again for being here and for sharing your expertise with our community. So let's dive in. Welcome, Annie. How are you?
I'm great. Yeah, let's dive in. I'm going to bring the energy tonight for everybody. And as people are like sort of tuning into this conversation, feel free to drop comments or questions in the chat. Happy to field your questions too. We'll definitely have time at the end and throughout if I see things pop up, I will also be able to answer questions as well. Mila did a great job of talking about my bio, but I'll tell you why the work that I do is important to me. So, I support students with all sorts of chronic health conditions. Diabetes is just one of them, and a lot of the students I work with have unpredictable flare-ups of their conditions or conditions like POTS or Ehlers-Danlos syndrome or Crohn's and co-occurring mental health conditions. I also work with students with physical disabilities, so wheelchair users, mobility device users. Many of the students that I work with also have multiple conditions, right? Because oftentimes we don't fit neatly into one little box. So that might be you. You might be a person who has lots of things going on and lots of things to consider as you're navigating the transition to college. Mila mentioned that I worked at Georgetown University as the Associate Director of the Disability Support Office there. Their Disability Support Office is called the Academic Resource Center, but the Disability Support Office has a different name at almost every institution. So that's something that you will need to know about as you are navigating the process to go to college. So tonight we're going to be talking about the college accommodations process. But before we dive into that, it's really helpful to just sort of ground ourselves in some of the data. So I put some of this together. We don't have to go too deeply into it, but I also just want people to know that you're not alone. When you're going to college, 21% of undergraduate students report having a disability, and that's all types of disabilities. So it's learning disabilities, it's ADD, it could be mobility, it could be a chronic health condition, a mental health condition, but that makes students with disabilities the largest marginalized population on any given college campus. So there are lots of students who are also receiving accommodations. So that's important to understand. Most disability support offices are used to seeing higher numbers of students with learning disabilities or ADHD. They see fewer students with physical disabilities and chronic health conditions. So that means that there are about 4,500 colleges in the United States. Every college has a disability support office. All of those disability support offices operate a little bit differently. They may or may not have students who have diabetes and are getting accommodations at present time, right? So they may or may not have familiarity with diabetes and diabetes related devices and things like that. So there might be a bit of a learning curve for the people that you're interacting with. So that's something to just be thinking about as you're engaging in the process to choose a school and also as you're going on to college. At any college, most disability support offices have about 10 to 20% of undergraduates who are receiving accommodations. It might be more at some of the schools that you're interested in. But 10 to 20% is sort of the average number. So if you are at a school that has 8,000 people, that's like probably over 1,000 students who are registered with the Disability Support Office. If you're at a school with 30,000 people, you're talking about thousands of students who are registered with the Disability Support Office. So that just gives us a little bit of perspective. I grabbed this chart from a report that came out last year from the Government Accountability Office, which pulls from national post-secondary student aid data. And it tells us the estimated number of college students with disabilities by main type of disability. And it shows you from 2004 on the left side all the way up to 2020. So it used to be around 11% of students. And then we've had a jump from 2012 to 2020 to 21% of students having disabilities on college campuses. Behavioral emotional shows you that's primarily students with learning disabilities. You can see other disabilities. That's where the health conditions would sort of be lumped into, right? So, and that's just something to just show you just how many students we're talking about here that have disabilities on college campuses. A quick overview of the laws, because this is super important to contextualize this conversation. So when you are in the K through 12 setting, the law that is most important to the accommodations process is IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. That law governs special ed services and supports for students with disabilities in public schools, so it doesn't apply to private schools. Then we have Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. That's an anti-discrimination act that says that students cannot be discriminated against because of their disability. Many students with type 1 diabetes actually have 504 plans in their high school, and the 504 plans might provide the student with some accommodations, but not with services. So if you have services or modifications, that's usually under IDEA, which you would have an IEP, an Individualized Education Plan. So Section 504 applies to private schools. It also applies to public K through 12 schools, and it applies to colleges. But 504 plans do not follow a student to college. Even though the same law applies, it's a different subset of the law that applies to the college. So colleges create their own accommodation plans for students. And that falls under the next law, which is the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that law provides for reasonable accommodations in the education setting and employment setting. And I did air quotes for that, reasonable accommodations, because what is reasonable is sort of based on the program of study that the student is in, the types of classes that they're studying, and the types of things that they're engaging in. There was a really great question that just popped up in the chat, and it made me realize I didn't answer this question. An IEP does not follow a student to college either. IEPs, 504 plans do not go to college with the student. Every college has their own documentation process for the student to receive accommodations. You might hear from your high school counselor that an IEP follows a student or a 504 follows a student. It's not true. It's a big myth in the high school side. And if you go, you don't have to trust me. You can go and verify for yourself. So you should think about the university that you're interested in, and you can look up the Disability Support Office. So if you go to the university website and you put in disability services, you'll find the Disability Support Office website. And then it'll also show you what the process is for requesting accommodations. So Mila helpfully put in the link to our previous webinar where Adrian Fromberg, who's a college consultant, and I talked about the process of going to college these days, and 2025 is when we're recording this. And it's a really helpful way to start to understand sort of the differences between high school and college in terms of what sort of to expect in that transition phase. So yes, so IEPs don't go to college, 504 plans don't go to college. Students have to follow the individual institution's process to request accommodations, which usually requires, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, a student with a health condition, for example, to provide documentation from their healthcare provider about their condition and about what accommodations that they need. And we'll get into the nitty-gritty of that tonight. But thanks for that question. So keep those questions coming. I love them. They're fun for me to answer as I'm going along. The other thing that's really different from high school is FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. This is the law that protects students' educational record. So usually when a student's in high school, their parents can access their educational record. They can connect with teachers at school and talk to the administrators. But once a student either turns 18 or they matriculate to college, they sign the dotted line, they're going to college, all of the communication and information goes to the student. And if the student wants to share that information with their guardians or parents, they can choose to. If you all have a conversation, parents and students, you can sign a FERPA waiver so that parents actually have access to the student's educational record, like their grades, and the billing and all of that stuff. But otherwise, everything goes to the student. So that's a huge shift from high school to college. So let's talk about this. I talked about the fact that an IEP or a 504, it doesn't follow a student to college. That doesn't mean that those things aren't valuable information for the Disability Support Office to have. So we will talk about that supplementary documentation in a minute. But first, when a student commits to a school, they can start the process to request accommodations. So right now it's October, right? So if your student is applying to college for next fall, one of the things that they might want to be thinking about is just holistically, is this college going to be a good fit for me, right? So they're applying to probably a number of schools, maybe 8 to 10 schools. They're looking at major, they're looking at the school culture, they're looking at finances, distance from home, whatever those typical things are. They might also want to factor in disability support services and academic support services as a piece of that puzzle. So you can actually look at the Disability Support Office website. One really helpful thing, and you'll see this later on my slides, is to check and see, is there a diabetes link chapter at that school? Can I connect with current students who have diabetes and have maybe are getting accommodations or living this college lifestyle now to see what their experience is like at that school. That could be really helpful. But you can also look at the documentation requirements for each college. Because I know that some students on this call might have multiple conditions, we'll talk about accommodations and documentations for all of those conditions. We're going to be focusing on type 1 diabetes really tonight, but if you have other conditions too, this will be helpful information to think about. So, establishing a disability is the first step to request accommodations in college. And this is all the student. The student has to connect with the Disability Support Office. The student is doing the outreach. That's really important, very different from maybe the high school setting. So if your student has a learning disability or ADD, the college will likely require a full neuropsychological evaluation, educational evaluation that was done in the last 3 to 5 years. That's usually the standard for most four-year colleges these days. So you would want to see if you have a learning disability or dyslexia or dysgraphia or your student has ADD, what documentation do you currently have? And do you need to get something updated prior to going away to college? You can look at that university's Disability Support Office website to see what their specific requirements are. So that would be one of the things that you should do. If your student has a mental health condition, you might be thinking about a psychological evaluation or a letter from their therapist or their psychologist that talks about what their diagnosis is, whether it's, generalized anxiety disorder or another mental health condition, maybe what medication they're taking, how that impacts them, and then what the accommodations are that the provider would be recommending. And then finally, we have a healthcare provider letter. So for most students with chronic health conditions or physical disabilities, they're usually providing a letter from their healthcare provider. And that letter would be from their specialist physician typically, or although it could be from your general practitioner if they can speak to your condition and your needs. And usually the college will require that the letter has the diagnosis, an outline of the functional limitations. So that means how the condition impacts the student. So that might mean like fatigue, the student experiences fatigue, or the student experiences brain fog because they take a certain medication. So those are the functional limitations. And then a recommendation of accommodations. So what accommodations do they need? It might be breaks during exams or ability to have phone accessible so that you can check your numbers, or whatever the accommodations might be, extra time on exams, things like that. So you'll really want to look at the specific documentation requirements at each of the schools that you're interested in. Supplemental documentation that could be important are things like an IEP. You can also submit that too, although it's not primary documentation of a disability at most schools. Your 504 plan, that could be really helpful for the people in the Disability Support Office to see so that they can see what types of accommodations you had in the high school setting. Um, your ACT or SAT accommodations could be also helpful for them to see. Um, I will just say, too, that I had a few students when I worked at Georgetown who were diagnosed with type 1 diabetes like in their senior year of high school. And so they didn't have a history of having had accommodations. So they didn't know sort of how this whole process worked or what to ask for. And I was able to guide them through this process. But that's a great example of someone who didn't have accommodations previously, but needed them in the college setting once they had that diagnosis. So they had documentation from their healthcare provider, from their doctor that showed me, yes, they actually have type 1 diabetes, and I worked with them to figure out what accommodations would be good for them. But you shouldn't expect that every person in a disability support office knows what accommodations might be reasonable for type 1 diabetes. So we're actually going to talk about what types of accommodations that students can think about and request so that you guys have tools in your toolbox so that you're ready to do those things. So this one just has the supplementary documentation. None of those are typically accepted as primary documentation, but good to have on hand. So as you're sort of like getting your documentation together, throw these in the binder, the virtual binder, so you've got them ready to go if you want to submit those with your documentation to the Disability Support Office. So the first thing that we should be thinking about are the types of accommodations. So college is much broader than high school. In high school, your accommodations might just be for academic settings, but in college, we might be thinking about housing and dining as well. If you have physical disability too, or another type of chronic health condition that maybe impacts your stamina or causes a lot of fatigue or impacts your mobility, you might also be thinking about transportation accommodations too. So we have to think about the whole college experience, not just the academics, although I'm sure your parents would love it if we just focused on the academics because college life is actually more than just academics. If you're living there, then there's going to be some needs that you have. So some typical, accommodations that we might be thinking about for academic examples are things like extra time on exams, a note taker, maybe a private testing room. And that could be necessary if you have, your phone or beeping or things that happen related to your condition. It could be flexibility in attendance or extensions on assignments, especially if your diabetes is not as controlled and you're experiencing a lot of fatigue. The ability to have your phone out. Some professors are really cracking down on phone access and things like that, and some people need to have access to their phones so that they can monitor and make sure everything's okay. So, these are all things that a student could request. Housing, if you're experiencing a lot of fatigue or other needs related to your health condition, you might be requesting a single room. That's a thing that sometimes people need for rest and recovery. Access to a fridge. different schools have different things. Most schools you can have like a mini fridge in your room, right? But you might need more than that, or you might be looking at a school that's super old and their electrical load output doesn't allow you to have a fridge and a microwave. So you might need that as an accommodation, or access to a kitchen so that you can make your own food. Sometimes students who maybe are, doing injections or taking medications and they're not comfortable doing that in front of their roommate or their friends, they might ask for an ensuite bathroom so that they could take care of some of their needs or medical needs in the bathroom to have like a separate space if that was necessary. So these are all just sort of considerations that you could be thinking about and asking about as you're engaging in the process to request accommodations. Um, in terms of like dining stuff, which comes up a lot, right? Like food is important for all of us, and it might be more important if you're monitoring certain aspects of your food intake. So you might be asking about, special diets. Most colleges have a nutritionist in their dining hall. Um, that students can access and connect with. We might also be talking about allergy-free. People have co-occurring conditions. So if you have a peanut allergy or if you have a gluten allergy or celiac, that could be another thing to think about as you're navigating the college transition and accommodation process. So usually the Disability Support Office handles the academic accommodations. They might also handle the housing accommodations. And they may also handle the dining accommodations. But sometimes some universities have the housing folks, the residence life folks deal with the housing pieces, and they have the dining people deal with the dining accommodations. But at most places, the Disability Support Office is like the hub for all of the accommodation request processes. And just for planning purposes, since we're in October now and people who are on this call might be thinking about, the getting into college in the spring and then setting themselves up, housing accommodations are usually due well before the academic accommodation request. So usually May 1st is the national decision deadline. That's when students have to commit to a school. Usually, housing accommodations are due immediately, and students need to be prepared for that. So you'd have to have all your documentation and go through the process at that time or before that time. So you'd want to look at when is the housing request due for the specific school that you're interested in or the school that you've committed to. Um, so one of the questions that just popped up was what accommodations does a student with diabetes most often request? I think it's a great question. I think one of the things that sometimes comes up is able to have their phone out, food and drink. Access to food and drink is another one because, your professor might not want you rifling around in your backpack, or you might be in a sterile lab setting. So you might actually have to like walk outside to grab, eat a granola bar or whatever you need to eat. But so those are two of like the main ones. It really depends on the individual. So accommodations are always on a case by case basis. But if your diabetes causes brain fog or fatigue and you need more time to do things, you might be requesting extra time or extensions on assignments or things like that. It sort of depends on where you're at with your diabetes and your management, and how much it impacts you because the impact is different on different people, right? Um, One thing I think that's really important to recognize, I'm going to go to the next slide. We've got some accommodation hiccups here, but um, colleges don't do like healthcare plans. I know a lot of students who have diabetes in the high school setting might have like a health plan or a plan with their team at school, the counseling team or the nursing team at school. So if something happens, there's a plan in place. That's not a thing that carries over to college. So it's really on the student to be able to advocate for themselves, to communicate their needs, to talk to their roommates, to have these conversations, to let professors know what's going on. Because that's the other thing that's different. When a student is approved for an accommodation in the college setting, the professor just gets an accommodation letter from the disability office that says, Joe Smith needs extra time on exams, a note taker, and access to food and drink during class. but the professor doesn't know anything about the condition that the student has. So the student has to go and connect with the professor to have a conversation about how the accommodations will work in their classroom. And so sometimes that's really different and challenging for students from what they encountered in high school, where teachers kind of know what's going on. Um, so you have to be able to self-advocate. That's a really important skill set to have in place in the college setting. So some of the hiccups. So sometimes students will say things like, "Oh, when I go to college, I won't need accommodations. I'm not going to need them, and I've got it all figured out. It's all going to be great." I always say that accommodations are like insurance. You hope you never have to use it, but you're glad you have it if you get into an accident. So, my advice to all of you would be to go ahead and request the accommodations, get approved for the accommodations. If you choose not to use them, that's up to you. No one forces you to use accommodations in college. But if you don't request the accommodations, professors don't have to give you accommodations. So if you did not request accommodations through the official university process, and then you're asking a professor for extra time or to be able to access something, they don't have to give it to you. So that is problematic. That could come back to bite you. Accommodations aren't retroactive. That's another thing for you to know. So if you decide in October that you need them because you're behind in class, because you've been experiencing highs and lows and the adjustment and all of the things, um, those accommodations don't apply to what has already happened. Plus, many disability support offices, it can take them 4 to 6 weeks to even review the documentation and get you through the process to get approved for accommodations. So it's a really smart idea to get the accommodations in place up front. As soon as you commit to the school, start the process to request accommodations and get them on the books as it were, so that you have them in place if you need to use them. That's going to be really important. Um, it is rare, but it sometimes happens that accommodations get denied. So the Disability Support Office might deny an accommodation, and there's a lot of reasons that that might happen. It could be that the documentation that your doctor provided didn't really spell out why something was needed. I would say that's probably the most common reason, is that the documentation is insufficient. But if that happens to you, you can ask the Disability Support Office, why was my accommodation request denied? Um, every college has an appeal process that's a requirement, so you can appeal the denial if you feel that it was done unfairly, or you can also provide them with further information of why to substantiate why you need something. I know that sounds like super stressful, and it puts the onus on the student to have to like advocate and re-advocate. Um, but oftentimes, and it's rare that accommodations get denied, especially for something like this, but like diabetes. But it might happen. You might have a person on the other side of the desk in the disability support office who doesn't understand the connection between the limitation that the student is experiencing and the specific request for the type of accommodation. So you might have to appeal that process. If for some reason that appeal did not work out the way that you wanted it to, the next step would be to connect with the Office of Civil Rights, which is part of the Department of Education, um, or through a private lawsuit. Um, right now, in this context, in October 2025, when we're recording this, there is sort of some fuzziness about whether or not the Department of Education will still be in existence. And in fact, the Office of Civil Rights has really been diminished, demolished, to the point where there aren't a lot of people, lawyers left to review complaints that students are making. And so many students now are turning towards private lawsuits as a way to navigate when they're having a challenge with a request for reasonable accommodations. But let's all pray that none of this happens or gets to that level, and that you've all done your homework and know what documentation you are submitting and have connected with disability support offices to understand their process prior to getting to any of these points. That would be the ideal situation. So, speaking of the ideal situation, because it is October, the things that you can do now, you can start researching colleges during your college search process, or even if you are submitting applications right now, and this is just popping into your mind that you should also think about the search in the context of your diabetes or your healthcare needs or your disability needs. You can check out the disability support offices. So you can reach out to disability support offices to set up meetings. You can ask them, although, they might not know. They might send you to student health or to another part of the university to ask about how does a school handle medical emergencies. I will say that on most college campuses, the common practice if someone is having a medical emergency is to call 911. So most professors are trained or told to, if someone's experiencing a medical emergency, to call 911. Um, and that is the common practice. It's not like in a high school where you might have a school nurse or a protocol in place. Universities are largely risk adverse, and so they want to call the healthcare professionals to come in and render aid to someone who is having a medical emergency. So that will be a piece of the puzzle to ask about. Is food available late at night or 24/7? This sort of depends on like where you're going to college too. If you're on a more if you're in a more urban environment, you probably have more access to 24/7 everything. If you're in a more rural environment, you might not have access to everything. Or if you're on a smaller campus that is also rural too, like, the cafeteria might close at a certain time. There might not be as many options around campus for food. So just asking about that. Seeing if you can keep a fridge in your dorm room. Most colleges allow this again. But if it's just a mini fridge for two people, that might not be enough room for, all your drinks and your snacks and stuff and your medical supplies. So you might need to have two. So that's something that would be reasonable to ask for as well. Um, how are professors notified about accommodations? That's something to ask about. Most schools now, it's an online system, so they use like Clockwork or AIM or these other management systems that then automatically send emails to professors. But let me just say this, professors are human beings, just like me and you. And, they might not always check their email or they might not always be reading things in detail. So it's always a good idea to go and have a meeting with your professor to talk about your accommodations and also just to get to know them, like it could be a helpful relationship in the future. One of the questions that popped into the chat too is what are the signs that a school has a strong culture of support for students with medical conditions? And I think one of them is right here, right? So diabetes linked chapters, connecting with other students that have diabetes. I often tell students to, when they connect with the Disability Support Office, ask for the number of students that are registered with the Disability Support Office, and ask if there are other students with diabetes or ask if there are other students with chronic health conditions that have, unpredictable flare-ups, um, just to get a sense, like how many people are we talking about? Are there five? Are there 500? Like what are the numbers that might tell you, what the culture is like there? Also, you can ask to be connected with other students who have similar conditions. So you can say to the disability support office person, "Hey, would it be possible for you to reach out to the current students who you know and see if they'd be willing to talk to a prospective student?" That's a good way to do it because then no private information gets shared. Then they can reach out to the students and the students can say yes or no to be connected to you. So that's another way to navigate that. You might also want to connect with student health. Most colleges have a separate office that has student health, to ask about, what healthcare services that they have, but also what about pharmacy? What about supplies? If you get your supplies delivered by mail now, you're going to want to also ask about the mail system at college and how that works there, because most colleges have a centralized mail system where everything gets delivered, and then it might take a day or two for things to get out to where students then pick them up. And that may or may not work for you if you have stuff that needs to be refrigerated or things that, are run on a tight schedule. So you might have to think about some other ways to get your medical needs met. Let's see. Parents. Parents are still playing an important role, even if their role slightly diminishes as a student goes to college. The student has to be able to communicate and self-advocate and manage their condition relatively independently. I say relatively independently because I know there's probably a parent watching now who is monitoring their kid's blood sugar via their phone. Like at this very moment, potentially, right? Um, and I don't think that's not like, oh, you need to stop that right now. I'm a mom, I get it. It's it's like these are our kids and they're very important to us and we want to make sure that everything is under control. But the more we can start to hand over responsibility to our students to manage their own condition, the better off the student is going to be. So it's October now. If your student is going to college in late August, September, then start thinking about what are the things that parents are doing on the back end to make the trains run on time, and how can I start to bring my student into those things? So if mom or dad or a guardian is doing all the medication refills, is making sure that the student has all the supplies that they need, is refilling things for the student, getting everything prepped for them, maybe it's time to start thinking about how the student can start to manage some of those pieces by themselves because they're going to have to do that for themselves when they go away to college. If your student is maybe a junior in high school now and will be applying to college next year, you might want to start looking at like some summer programs at a college too, or some time away. So the student has to practice these things maybe for a week away at a college program or something over the summer so they start to get those skills down. There's other sort of typical skills that students can start engaging in too, right? Like laundry. I'm always surprised how many students have never done laundry, right? So starting to think about those things, shopping, money management, cooking. We don't teach really home economics anymore in most high schools, but there is a skill to navigating a grocery store. I can tell you that from personal experience. I have it down to a science. Or like, to thinking about simple meals or how we're cooking something. Money management is also very different for students too, because we don't really use cash anymore, right? Like, so how is your student going to be paying for things? Do they have a bank account? Have they ever used an ATM? I'm always amazed at how many students don't know, have never used an ATM because they do everything with Cash App or Venmo, which are also important for like the social aspects of college life, but they might have to use an ATM. They need to know like how much money is in their account and maybe keep track of that too. So that's important as well. Having the student, do their own medication refills is an important piece of the puzzle. Having the student know exactly what medications they take is really important, how much of that medication that they take. And this is stuff they can store, in their phone. That could be an important thing for them to sort of understand what's going on with them medically, who their doctors are, that sort of stuff. Students should take part in the 504 and IEP meetings and be a part of the conversations because the conversations are about them. They should start to take the lead in doctor's appointments too. So when they're talking to their healthcare providers, encouraging them, what are the questions that you have? Why don't you write those down and bring those to the doctor's appointment? And the thing that I think gets left out a lot, parents freak out about this, students are usually less concerned, emergency planning. So, what happens in the case of an emergency? It's always good to have a plan. A lot of parents that I work with who have students with diabetes are usually saying, like, well, if the student has a roommate, the roommate could be a helpful person if something goes wrong. That's true, and that could be the case. But that's also another young adult who's like 18 or 19 years old. And I think like it's good to have a plan A, a plan B, and a plan C, right? Like what are the triage points that we need to have in place so that everybody is comfortable, including the other student, right? So a lot of times, if we're relying on a roommate to help out, that could be pressureful for that person. So we need to make sure that that person sort of understands what their role is and what their role isn't. And from a university standpoint, that the other student shouldn't really be in that emergency management role. Of course, if there was something really critical and you'd hope that someone would call for help, right? But the RA, the other students, they're not always people who can act very quickly in those types of emergency management situations. So it's important to have those conversations with the student's roommate and with the RA as well to see what are the limits to what they will be able to do. I know that rescue meds are sometimes something that comes up. Most RAs are not able to administer as university employees. They're not able to administer rescue meds. So that's something important that you make sure you know and they know and everybody knows like what the protocol is. So having those conversations is going to be a piece of the puzzle. So for students, the key is self-advocacy. You need to know about your condition. What are the things that impact you? How do you need to take care of yourself? You need to be able to talk about your condition too. The more you talk about it, the easier it gets. That's why taking a lead in the IEP meetings, 504 meetings is going to be really important. And also like in, managing your own medication and things like that. Looking at all areas of your life too, not just the academic stuff, but also like, your home life, your social life. What are the needs that you have to make those things work smoothly? My guess is that sometimes, parents are intervening and supporting in ways to make things really easier for students. And so we need to be upfront about those things and having conversations about those things so that students are really prepared for when that support ends and when they're living more independently. Um, and using your tools, right? So students should be really prepared for when things don't work out perfectly, because they're probably not always going to be perfect. So, we need to know who are our allies on campus? Where can we go if we're having a challenging time with a professor and he's not giving us the accommodations that we've already been approved for? What do? We probably connect back with the Disability Support Office, but like who can we go to? If we're having a challenge with getting, our medical needs met, what are the levers that we need to pull? Because those are the sort of adulting skills that sometimes get left behind, and students, rely just on their parents to fix things for them. But this is really that time in life where students need to be able to step up and start to manage some of those pieces a little bit more independently. So a lot of the work that I do with students is actually coaching them on all of these pieces of self-advocacy skills and how to navigate these processes. So here's some ways that I work with students. So I do customized planning for students with physical disabilities and health conditions, and I work with students on comprehensive college planning starting in junior year, because that's really when students start to think more about it. But we go through what are the accommodations that you're going to need? What are the questions we should be asking disability support offices? What are the other considerations that we might be looking at related to specific schools that the student's interested in? I also work with juniors, students or seniors, students who are transferring, students who have taken a leave of absence. I also have an online course called Preparing Students with Physical Disabilities and Health Conditions for College. And it's sort of a DIY approach to going through all of these pieces as well, to think through the change in laws, the types of accommodations, connecting with schools, independent living skills. And it has American Occupational Therapy Association CEU credits, as well as the Association of Social Work Board CEU credits. And I partner with schools and other organizations to do speaking and consulting like this too. I put a QR code on here, and I'll be able to, once I stop my share, I can drop a little link in the chat too. But the QR code will take you to an information sheet where you can find all my contact information too. I'm on Facebook and Instagram if people want to connect. And let's see, this one. So yeah, you can find me at accessiblecollege.com. You can also email me at info@accessiblecollege.com. I'm on Facebook, I'm on Insta. Um, yeah, and I will leave it there. I know I just gave you tons of information and you're probably processing and digesting all of these pieces. But if you have any questions, you can pop them in the chat and I'd be happy to take them for you.
This is such an amazing information and so important. I went through through this process in 2018, 2019, 2020, when my son was getting ready to start college. And I think there's one thing that is very important. This is very time consuming. If we want to have, if we want to make sure that this process is successful, there's a lot of details. And that's why we want to make sure that every parent and or every young adult that is here understands that you're not alone. We have your back. Like, there's information, but you have to make sure that you know what you're talking about. Let me ask you something.
Mhm.
One of the questions that I have, like, there are a lot of students that probably are shy, or they might get nervous if they need to go talk to their professor or talking to other students like their peers. Like, what tips can you provide to that young adult that says, okay, I know that I need to start adulting. I know that it's my health. I need to learn to advocate for myself. How do I get started?
Yeah. I think like for the specific question about like talking to professors or talking to university administrators, when I'm working with students, I often suggest that we like write out a script, right? So like we come up with the talking points, like the bullet talking points, we write out a script. And sometimes like even just like sitting with a student and helping craft the email is really helpful because a lot of students had not really had to write emails and they write in weird text language. Um, which is also an adulting skill, right? I remember in my first job, my boss was like, "You need to start an email with a greeting first before you jump into the main part of the email." But these are all learned skills, right? So students can start to, create a script so that they're comfortable having those conversations. I think the more tools that a student has in their toolbox, the better off they can be. I also think that families, in terms of like the healthcare management piece, like I have a kid. I was a teenager once. I like I remember all these things. I didn't want to listen to my parents. I still don't want to listen to my parents, right? Like that never goes away, kids. Um, but the things that we can rely on. So luckily students here have Diabetes Link that they can connect with, and there's so many great resources, and we have a couple slides on that, Mila, that we'll put up at the end as well. But I think one of the things that students and families can do is start to think about like what are the little bite-sized things, steps we can take now. So it doesn't have to be all at once. It can be slow and incremental. So maybe the student starts by, putting all their healthcare information onto a document or into their phone. And then maybe it's also like, okay, next month we're going to work on medication refills. And so mom and dad bring the student into that process, do it with them for a while, train them up, and then let them try to do it the next month independently. Learning these skills, like handing off these skills while the student is still at home, is actually a really good idea because they're still semi-supervised. I think one of the hardest things is that parents have to learn to lengthen the leash a little bit,
Mhm.
which is stressful, as you know, Mila, because you are a parent of a type 1 diabetic.
I
It's
know.
stressful. And maybe like you, what did you do? How did you manage that experience and navigate that as a parent?
Well, I have to confess, the first month was very tough. um, because even though like he was living on its own, we were pretty close to him, but we wanted for him to have that experience. Um, and surprisingly, in one of or two occasions that I had to call him and ask him like, hey, like, you're really low or something doesn't add up with your graphic. When he would explain, okay, I already treated or I did this, blah, 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 he did everything by the book. So I was like, oh, he was listening to me all those car rides where we were talking like back and forth to the baseball field. Like, he was paying attention. They might seem they are not, But I think that once they see themselves by themselves, um, they're like, okay, I know what I have to do. They might seem like, yeah, okay, like super chill, super relaxed, but they are paying attention. We have one question here. Do you think it's better for a student to have a private room or a roommate in college? I don't want my daughter to burden her roommate with her beeping. I understand that, but would like for her to have the experience of having a roommate as well. What are your thoughts and opinions on this matter?
Yeah, like I think it really depends on what your daughter wants. I think like there's a couple of things to consider. So most colleges have like a roommate selection process. It's sort of like online dating for roommates. Um, so at most schools, like you put in your preferences into this form. It's like I want someone who gets up early or stays up late or somebody who's not noisy or non-smoker, whatever. It has all these preferences in it. And then you get matched with like potential roommates, and then you talk to those people. Um, it could be that, like, at that point, if she really wants a roommate, that she is, at a certain point in that process, disclosing to the roommate that she has a pump that beeps at night. You might find that someone else is like, oh, it's not a problem because I sleep with my earbuds in and I play white noise or I use noise canceling headphones or whatever, whatever. Or I'm, like it doesn't bother me. I could sleep through a hurricane. So, like I think like it's up to your daughter what she wants to try and what she wants to like the conversations that she wants to have because like I mean, the other person might be like, well, cool, I snore all night. Everybody, people have different things anyway, or like I am up all night or whatever. So I think it's just a matter of like being prepared for the conversations that'll come with that, right? So like if she wants to have that, if she doesn't want to have the conversation and she just, like wants to have that privacy, she might have to go through the process to request a housing accommodation. Um, Housing accommodations are based on demonstrated need and availability. So it could be that the school doesn't have, they have a finite number of single rooms that they set aside for students with medical needs, and it may or may not be that she is granted one of those rooms. So you need to be prepared for the possibility that they might not have a single room available, that somebody else's need might be greater for that single room, so they have to give it to the other student. It's just something to be prepared for. There are some colleges that offer single rooms to, first year students just more generally. So, like, that might be a thing to consider if she knows for sure she's going to want a single room. But yeah, I hope that helps. Probably made it muddier and didn't answer completely, but yeah.
I do understand her question completely. Also, there are some colleges that even if you're a freshman, you can lease an apartment. And in those apartments, you have like one up to 4 or 6 bedrooms. You're going to have a roommate, but you're going to have your own bedroom. That was the case with my son. He always had his own bedroom, but he always had 3 other roommates where we could use them in case of emergency. Thankfully, we never had to call them for anything. But at least he knew, like, once he shut his door, if his Dexcom would beep, it was inside his room. But at the same time, he felt confident that if he needed something, he had someone else that could help him just in case something happened.
Yeah.
There's another question. Do you have meetings coming up in the future for college students to meet other students?
Do you want me to, Mila, do you want me to I'll put your slides back up too, because
Yes,
I think
please.
you had a ton of great resources. Hang on, everybody. Let me get these slides back up as best I can.
So
Uh,
Jessica, we just had an event in LA, which was incredible. We had active students, we had past students, past fellows from our programs. And one of the things that I would encourage your daughter to do is to join our Discord channel, which is in the next slide. But for example, here we have all the resources. If we can go back to the first
Yep.
one, the previous one. Thank you, Annie. So we have resources for parents and for young adults. At the Diabetes Link, we want to make sure that we're not only educating the young adult, because as Annie mentioned, they have to learn how to advocate for themselves. They have to start like making big strides within their health. But we also want to make sure that for us parents, we have all the resources and all the information we need. Going to college is a big step and it could be a big shock for the families. So us parents, especially moms, we need to be ready. We need to understand what are the rules. We need to understand how college works. My son was diagnosed when he was very, very young. He was 3. So up until he went up to college, like diabetes was always in our household. Once he left for college, I was like, oh my God, I'm kind of bored not doing any diabetes related thing. But that's part of the process. And what we want to make sure is that we provide information and resources. We have an amazing Facebook group for parents. I invite you to join. I'm going to be sharing these slides and the recording of tonight's webinar. So all those links are clickable. You can go there. It's going to take you to each page, the newsletter, to the Caregiver Resource Hub, and to the Off to College program. We want to make sure that if you have any questions, or if your student, your young adult has any questions, please let us know. That's why we're doing these webinars. We want to make sure that once you decide, okay, this is the college that I want, now I'm going to list all the things that I have to get in order before I start like preparing for the rest of it. And we can go to the next slide, please. And for the online peer support, for young adults, we have a online community in Discord. When I started listening or hearing about Discord, it was because of my 3 kids, young adults. They are gamers. And this is a platform that is very popular within young adults. On our Discord community, it's only young adults. I'm not allowed to be there. It's only our young staff at the Diabetes Link. We have young adults that live with type 1, and they're always like managing and checking what's going on. What we want to make sure is that this is a place for them to feel safe and go and ask the questions or talk about the topics that they probably do not feel comfortable mentioning at home. So this is a young adult only place for them, so they can go there and ask questions. We always get a lot of seniors once the at the May 1st decision day passes. We do have a lot of seniors saying, okay, I committed to UF or I committed to FSU. Is there anyone there? And that's how they start meeting each other. And I think that would be a great place, Jessica, for your daughter to go there and start meeting other young adults with diabetes. We also have our Instagram channel, our TikTok content that it's great. It's really funny, and we know how young adults are connected to TikTok today. And also we have our resource hub. On the resource hub, we have like from very basic diabetes management information, and even to how to get ready for a job interview, because we want to make sure that we are providing education and information and resources for that very long stage from 18 to 30, which starts when your kid decides to go to college, but then he graduates college. Now they have job interviews. How do I talk about my type 1 diabetes? Should I disclose that? Should I not disclose that? And we want to be able to provide all that information for them. Next slide. So, Annie, thank you so much again for joining us. I always enjoy and I keep learning. I wish I had met you before. When my son was going to college, you answered so many questions and things that for me, they were very difficult to understand. Annie just dropped the link to her website on the chat. And as I mentioned, I'm going to be sharing the slides and the recording with you tonight. And it's going to be on our resource hub also. Make sure to check out the first webinar, Going to College with a Health Condition. I shared the link before. So you can hear what Annie and Adrian shared with us about what are the steps. Like they provided timelines for your kid when it's in high school, what to do when in your junior year, in your sophomore year. So you have a better understanding and a clear path for these. On behalf of the Diabetes Link, thank you so much for being part of this conversation, and we hope to see you at our next webinar. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening and see you in November. Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye, Annie. Thank you.
Thank you. See you later.
Thank you so much.